Queen came, we got away with it. It was such a success. I don't know if you remember, but it was when they rowed her ashore and Prince Philip in canoes. When they hit the beach, the islanders picked the canoes up and carried them through the streets with the whole population singing. And the Queen took out a camera and started taking photographs, and that was the first time Her Majesty had ever been seen taking photographs, because it was just so colourful and so spectacular. They left on a Friday, they sailed on a Friday in the Royal Yacht, and we had the weekend off. Monday morning we went back into the office and we were sitting around saying, well, we're still so keyed up on meeting the Queen, it's so exciting. We don't really feel like working today. And at about 5 minutes to 8, the radio crackled into life from the Capitol, and it was an announcement that the Cabinet had gone in that morning, and they were much too excited to work. So at 5 to 8, they just declared another public holiday and said we could all start work on Tuesday. It could probably only be done in a place like Tuvalu, but it was absolutely the right decision. And after that, that was when we first arrived. It should have been all downhill from there, but we had wonderful times, which are described in the book. I was very popular, not because of me, but because of my wife, Christina, who is a Hong Kong lady. It turns out Tuvaluans are addicted to sweet and sour pork, but they don't know how to cook it. So shortly after we arrived, they butchered a pig, the trainees had butchered a pig, and they came to my wife and said, excuse me, do you know how to make sweet and sour pork? And she said, of course I do. Well, as you can tell, of course she does. You may have deduced that she's a very good cook. So when she said yes, they promptly delivered half a pig to our house and said, could we have that turned into sweet and sour pork for our feast this evening? So she spent all day producing sweet and sour, an enormous vat of sweet and sour pork, which took the trainees about 5 minutes to demolish. And they loved it. So after that, we could do no wrong. My wife was the most popular person in the country. There wasn't much to do in the evening. There was no television, no radio in the evenings. So eventually my wife became pregnant and opted to have the baby in Tuvalu. And our daughter Elizabeth was only the second foreigner ever born in the country. So that gave my wife mythical status. I could have been Jack the Ripper. They would still have tolerated me as long as my wife stayed in the country. So we had a wonderful, we were asked to stay on a bit longer to handle a South Pacific Forum Heads of Government meeting, which we did. But after 2.5 years, we had to come back. We were worried about Mark not being in school. So after 2.5 years, we came back. And we'd love to go back. We haven't made it yet, but one day we fully intend to go back to Tuvalu. I cannot leave the country without showing you this. That's one of the main roads in Funafuti, or it used to be, and that's what happens today. Now that did not happen when I was there, so anyone who tells you that sea level rise and global warming is a myth. That has happened not just in my lifetime, it's happened in my son's lifetime. This has happened in the last 40 years. And the highest point in Tuvalu is 24 feet above sea level. So most of it disappears when the sea level comes up 4 or 5 feet. They have a real problem, and hopefully it's something the world can do something about. So I came back to Hong Kong. I sailed on the passenger ship again, and a few other ships. And then I got a call from the boss of Hong Kong Salvage and Towage, which was Swire's tug company based in Hong Kong. Was asked would I go and set up a safety system and become a manager with Hong Kong Salvage and Towage. That meant I got to do all the fun things that they had going on, but I also got to go home at night. We'd been a bit worried because most of our married life, we'd never lived together. A few months, and then I'd be off to sea again. But 2.5 years into Tuvalu, we discovered we could actually tolerate each other. So I could come ashore and join Hong Kong Salvage, which I did. And over the next few years, we built some really impressive tugs. We got quite a good reputation for the tugs that we built for harbour towage, but we also did an awful lot of salvage. And I'm just going to talk about one particular month where we did 4 LOF jobs. The preferred salvage contract is LOF, Lloyd's Open Form, and it's no cure, no pay. What it says is, we, the salvage company, will go out and try to save your ship. If we fail, you pay us nothing. No cure, no pay. If we succeed, we will go to London to a maritime arbitrator, we'll put the case to him, and he'll decide how much the job was worth. And the average payout for a salvage award is about 10% of the value of everything you save, the ship, the fuel, the cargo. So to the insurance companies, that's a very good deal. If the ship sinks, they have to pay out 100%. If the salvage company can save it, they only pay out 10%. In 1 month, we had 4. That was our busiest ever month. But to put that in perspective, 4 LOF jobs in a month. Last year, worldwide, there were only 40 LOF contracts signed. So we were doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in those days. That was the Sea Star. This was the second ship. The first one was called Pskov. It was a Russian ship with a paper cargo. They had a fire in the engine room. Of course, the heat through the bulkheads set the paper on fire. We had to go out there, control the fire, contain the fire. It needed major firefighting and a lot of CO2, for example. So we had to bring the ship back into Hong Kong, fight the fire with Fire Services Department, and eventually we got it under control. But while we were still getting it under control, about 180 miles off Hong Kong, a tanker called Sea Star exploded. And you can see how violent the explosion was, because there's deck there that's ripped off and folded. It's hanging down over the side of the ship. There's chunks of deck there which have folded back. The only way to get from aft to forward was to crawl along a stiffener where those guys are there. When we got to the ship, she was on fire. There wasn't much cargo left in the cargo hold, so we could quickly put the fire out and tow her into Hong Kong. And there's a nice story that there was a sister ship to this one which had had a major engine meltdown. So the owner was able to cut the back end off of this ship and weld it to the front end of the other ship. And out of 2 wrecks, he made one going concern. And he had the other 2 halves to sell for scrap. I hope it's true. It deserves to be. But that's the sort of work we did. 3 guys died on that ship when it exploded. We only found 1 body. So it's not all fun and games. Sometimes it gets quite serious, but the other 2 were never found. And then we were just resting on our laurels and thinking how clever we were when a Greek container ship collided with a German passenger vessel in the Taiwan Strait. And we got LOF contracts on both of those ships. I was on the first tug. My colleague Ivan Schoon, who was the other salvage master, needed a few hours to get his tug ready, so I went out first. The deal was I would take whichever ship was in the biggest trouble, and Ivan would come along 6 hours later and pick up the other ship. It turned out that the ship in the biggest trouble was the Incheon Glory. There was a 20-foot container bay up on the forecastle. When we arrived, it was 6 feet long. The whole bow had concertinas, and it was flooded back to number 2 hold, that bulkhead there. everything forward of that was flooded. We managed to stop the flooding there, keep the rest of it dry, and we got it under control. But then we had to tow it back to Hong Kong. And there was nothing on the bow left that we could tow with. Everything was destroyed. So we had to tow it backwards. Now that's all very well in theory, but we knew we were towing a ship backwards, but what other ships saw, as they came towards us, they saw a tug coming towards them and a container ship going the other way. They had no idea we were connected, although we were showing all the signals, we were giving radio warnings. In those days on the coast of China, people didn't always listen to their radios. And the worst thing that can happen in a case like that is that a ship will try to sail between the tug and the tow, not realizing that it is a tow. And what happens then is it's going to cut the tow wire. And twice on that towage voyage back to Hong Kong, twice ships went between us and the tow. And the only thing you can do then is just before they hit your wire, you stop the engines on the tug. And the tug will stop dead, but the tow has a lot of momentum, will keep moving. So the towing wire will go slack. And if you time it just right, the ship, the interfering ship, will sail over the tow wire, and as soon as it's clear, you put the engines back on and get weight back on the tow line before the tow overtakes you and pushes you under. And you know, even talking about it, my pulse is going up. It's not something you do for fun. But we had to do it twice on that voyage. So that was 1992. We did 4 LOFs in a single month. And you can read about it in much more detail in the book. But at approximately 1 minute per year, I really have to hurry through this. The following year, in 1993, we actually made the front page of the Times in London, and the South China Morning Post, of course. A 6-week-old Boeing 747 operated by China Airlines bounced off the end of Kai Tak runway and into the harbour. And it was the most expensive, at the time, the most expensive airline plane in history, because it was only 6 weeks old. We got the job of recovering it, and we called in Boeing, because they built it, and said, how do you actually recover an aircraft from the water? To which they replied, don't look at us. When they hit the water, they're supposed to disintegrate. So we haven't actually got a way or a plan of recovering an aircraft. So we decided to treat it like a ship. We flew in 5-ton airbags from the UK and put the airbags, you put a strop under the hull and an airbag on each end, and then fill the airbags with compressed air, and that gives you 10 tons of buoyancy. So if you get enough airbags, you keep the thing afloat. Well, I was doing that while my boss was back in the office trying to work out how we were going to lift it. And there were lots of things on an aircraft that you don't think about when you normally deal with ships. One was we had to very quickly call in Customs and Excise Department to take away all the duty-free, because there was so much alcohol and so much tobacco lying around in the cabin that it was a horrible temptation for our crew. And they would, if they know if they touch anything that doesn't belong to them, they're sacked on the spot. But that was awfully tempting. So we had to get Customs and Excise to come in to remove the duty-frees. We had to get all the food containers off quickly before the food went wrong. To reduce the weight, we had to get all the seats out. And then we had to go down into the baggage compartments and get out all the luggage, all the baggage, which was horrible because that was waterlogged and very heavy, and we had to do it by hand. So we got it as light as we could. We had to get Shell from the airport to come and take the fuel off. But we hadn't even started this when the airport decided they had to blow the tail off the aircraft. because it was sticking up above the level of the runway. It might have blocked planes approaching. So Dominic Britton, who was the police bomb disposal guy at the time, he came in and blew the tail off for us so that we had a lower profile. And we discovered that the strongest place on an aircraft is the landing gear, and that we could actually go through the top of the wing to put a wire around the landing gear, and that would be the strongest place for lifting. We had to have the wires absolutely vertical. If they'd had an angle on them, the stresses would have been too great, so we had to build a special lifting beam at Hong Kong United Dockyards. We also had to lift it nose heavy, because if the tail was heavy, it would have flipped over backwards and made us all look stupid. And that meant we needed a second crane to hold the nose. So we had a crane barge that could lift the main aircraft, and we had to weld another crane barge to it to hold the nose. And 2 weeks after she went in the harbour, we lifted her. Now, government had built a grandstand for the press and for VIPs to watch this, and we were horrified. You know, salvors like to work in secret, in private. We don't want people watching us, because when it goes wrong, it can go spectacularly wrong. And I like to say that in my 20 years of doing this job, we never lost a ship we went out to save, and we never spilled any oil, which is why people have never heard of us. Because if we had spilled any oil or had a major disaster, we would have been very newsworthy. This was newsworthy, but fortunately, it went well. We didn't drop it. All the press in the grandstand got great photographs. One potential disaster, the crew of the Proteus, our crane barge, had a pet dog, a puppy really, and it was getting very excited, so they took a piece of rope and they tied it to the rib at the side. In its excitement, the dog jumped over the side, and my colleague George, who was not on the wing you can see, he was on the other wing, and he said, "Alan, you're hanging the dog," just as we're lifting the aircraft. So I said, "Oh, blow the dog." But in my best Cantonese, I said to one of the crew, "Go and get the dog." And he came back 20 seconds later with a shifting spanner. So obviously my Cantonese was no better then than it is now. But eventually my translator came back and I explained we must rescue the dog, and they did, and they tied it up somewhere more sensible. Unfortunately, that happened on the side away from the grandstand, so none of the press saw us hanging the dog. So on the front page of the papers next morning was photographs like that, not photographs of poor Bonzo being strangulated. We then had to bring the thing in through Kwun Tong typhoon shelter, because most of the airport, as you'll remember, was sloping seawall. We couldn't get close enough to land the aircraft back on the runway. And although it was already a total loss and the insurers were paying out, the accident investigators said it must be put back on the land. So we noticed that the Hong Kong Auxiliary Air Force, what's now Government Flying Service, their apron at Kai Tak had a straight seawall. We could get close enough there, but no one had ever been up through Kwun Tong typhoon shelter with such a big lift. So we had to do surveys. Marine Department moved all the mooring buoys out of the way, and we couldn't even use our own tugs. We had to use local tugs, which were smaller. But we got it through. We got it there. But the night before the lift, Architectural Services Department said, "Excuse me, we've had a look at the plans, and there are fuel tanks underneath Government Flying Services apron, so the concrete is not strong enough to support the weight of a 747. You'll have to land it somewhere else." So we looked around. The only other place we could find was the taxiway bridge, which is still there, the bridge that goes across. And our draftsman calculated that if I could approach at exactly the right angle, we would have 6 inches clearance over the parapet to land the aircraft back on the taxiway bridge. So those were the fine tolerances we were dealing with. And I see. No, it's going backwards. There. That's right. It's gone mad, but it's technology that does that. Thank you. So, famous for 5 minutes, I suppose. Meantime, we were still building beautiful tugs, and we found that if Hong Kong tugs were so popular overseas that we could run them, work them really hard for 15 years, and then sell them at a very good price. My boss actually sold one for more than he paid for it 15 years later. I never quite did that, but I got close a couple of times. This is one of the Hong Kong tugs which had been sold to Australia, so we put it on the slipway in Ching Yi, painted it, made it look nice, and sold it to the Australians. We delivered it to Australia for them. The propellers underneath, they're unusual. They revolve through 360 degrees, so you can point the power in any direction. It makes the tugs very, very maneuverable, very powerful, and in demand. The other types of tugs we had were the seagoing tugs. These were the tugs we used for all the big salvage jobs. They were bigger. The bow was the same for doing harbour towage, but the back deck was for salvage equipment, pumps, things like that. But by the time I reached my early 50s, salvage was drying up. There wasn't as much salvage work, and I was getting a little bit bored, and I thought, well, if I don't leave now, I never will. And it was a bit frightening because I'd only had 2 jobs up until that point in my entire life, one with the RFA and one with Swire. But I left and started my own company as a consultant, and this is the sort of job I get now. That ship, it's a lovely story because they loaded cargo in China, a cargo of soil stabilizer, which is a type of cement they use for building roads in the Third World. They loaded the cement, then they came to Hong Kong to load fuel. But when they came into Hong Kong, there was a bit of swell. The ship started rolling, and these pallets of cement were all wrapped in plastic, so they were very slippery. They all slid over on one particular roll. They all slid to one side, and the ship took an enormous lift. So the crew, there was a marine police boat going past at the time, so the crew waved to the police, and they were all rescued by the marine police. But when they jumped off, they forgot one small detail. They didn't stop the engine. So the ship sailed on up the harbour. And the government wouldn't call a tug company to say, yeah, can you go and sort that out? Because they're worried that if they call my tug company, the other tug companies will accuse them of favouritism. So what they do is they send a message to Loynd's in London, and Loynd's in London issue a notice, and then all the local tug companies are free to bid on the job. By that time, this ship had hit the rocks in Chung Chau and gone over. So I got the job of, from the insurance company, of supervising the wreck removal, which meant going out to tender around the world for salvage companies to bid on the wreck removal, vetting those bids and picking the best one, which with most insurance companies, of course, means the cheapest one. And then supervising to make sure they didn't do it wrong or make any mistakes or cause pollution or upset the marine department in any way. So that was my job. And this one had to be done by Buckley. And Buckley is what they did to the Costa Concordia in Italy a few years ago. It involves passing a wire under the ship, welding one end to the high point and then pulling the other end and gradually turning the ship. And you can see the main lifting wires there and there. So they are physically turning the ship over while you pump the water out and patch up the holes. And with any luck, if it all goes well, it then gets towed off to China for repair or scrapping. But you're not allowed to send waste material to China anymore, so they tend to send the ships to China for repair. And when they get there, say, oh, they're too badly damaged to repair, we'll have to scrap them. Now, I just want to mention Grace Charity. When I worked for Corporate Man, I always thought that they didn't do enough for charity. They didn't give enough of their profits back to the community. And I always said if I had my own company, I would. And when I first set the company up, it was a freak, but I made an awful lot of money the first few months. I've never done that since. And now with COVID and no work, I wish I'd kept the money that I did make. But I met Grace Charity, and they go to poor villages in China, the very poorest provinces, mountain villages where the primary schools are unsafe. And they've got to deal with the provincial authorities. If they can find a donor to pay half the cost of a new safe school, the province will pay the other half. And just once in our lives we had enough money to do this, and this is, because we gave them the money, we got naming rights. So my wife's name is Chan Chawa. I wanted to call it the Chan Chawa Memorial School, but she didn't think that was very funny because she's not dead yet. So it's the Chan Chawa School. But those are the little darlings that went there. That is what the village was like, and that is what the previous school in the village had been like before it slid down the mountainside one day. And these schools are so important because these are ethnic minority kids. If they don't go to school, if they don't learn Potomois, they aren't going to get ahead. They aren't ever going to get out of the village, probably. So if anyone's got a couple of $100,000 they don't need, I can recommend Grace Charity. Very good. And we also, this was in Guizhou province, they took us out to see the Guizhou Gorges, which are absolutely stunning. More spectacular, I would say, than the Yangtze Gorges, but hardly known at all because they're so inaccessible and so remote. But it was an incredible experience. I just wish I could make, if you all buy my book, perhaps I'll be able to do it again, okay? Well, you have to buy several copies each, I think. We're running out of time, but this is a job I did in Discovery Bay, again, for the insurance company, making sure that the right company was given the job and that they didn't spill that oil. In fact, we had to do this job in two parts. The first thing was to stop that oil polluting Discovery Bay. So that contract was awarded to Hong Kong Salvage and Towage, my former company. And the reason for that is we needed to use oil spill dispersant. And oil spill dispersant is fairly nasty. It's fairly toxic stuff. It's good at cleaning up oil spills, but it doesn't do the environment a great deal of good. It's better than crude oil, but not much. And Hong Kong Environmental Protection Department will only permit 2 types of oil spill dispersant. The rest are banned. And Hong Kong Salvage and Towage keep stocks. And this stuff expires, it's got a shelf life, so they invest their own money to keep a stock. So they won the job for cleaning up the oil spill because they had everything they needed. And the Chinese companies, for example, could not provide acceptable types of oil spill dispersant chemicals. So Hong Kong Salvage did the oil cleanup. but they were too expensive for the wreck removal, which was done by Guangzhou Salvage. And that's the sort of thing I get up to these days, and I just needed a photograph for the tail end. I recently did a thing for Discovery Channel about a tug accident in Scotland. They've got a series called Disasters at Sea, and I was involved in filming one of those episodes with Discovery Channel. And that's it, really. The book's so cheap you wouldn't believe. Does anyone have any questions?
We know about the logistics, about your operation. How about the coordination between governments? Obviously, some of the accidents happen in international waters. So how do you deal with that, say, between China, Hong Kong, Philippines, Singapore, or Taiwan? Thank you.
In a way, when it happens in international waters, you're better off because you can deal with it any way you want to. As soon as you come within territorial waters, you're reporting to the local authorities, and whether that's Marine Department in Hong Kong or the Chinese authorities. And these days, ships are quite unpopular, especially when things are going wrong. We had a very good relationship with Hong Kong Marine Department, and we were never refused permission to bring a casualty into Hong Kong because they trusted us. If we said, it's okay, it's not going to sink, they trusted us to bring it in. But you've just seen on the news, I'm sure, the ship off Colombo in Sri Lanka, which had a container of nitric acid, which started leaking. Now, they were in the Persian Gulf, and they asked one of the ports in the Persian Gulf, could they take off that container of nitric acid? And the port said, no, we don't have the facilities ashore for dealing with a leaking container of nitric acid. And the ship said, well, we sure don't have the facilities on the ship to deal with it, and it's still leaking. And they were sent away. Then a port in India, and they said, they again requested, could we put that container ashore? And again, the port said, no, we don't have the facilities. And Colombo, bless its heart, the Sri Lankans said, yes, you can come here. And they just got there, and they just anchored off when the fire started. And now Colombo is handling potentially a major environmental disaster, only because they were good enough to let the ship call there when other ports had sent them packing. So that's always a consideration of where do we go where the authorities will be reasonable and sensible. But then, of course, you try not to have the environmental disaster, because if they let you in and you screw it up, they're not going to let you in next time.
Yes, a related question is, what major changes do you see or do you experience before and after the handover in 1997? Because you may have to deal with the Chinese government after that, and are there any changes in practices, or are there stories of like joint operations between China and Hong Kong?
Very good question, but strangely enough, we saw very little difference, and still no real cooperation in the commercial sphere. I'm sure there's more cooperation at government level. Only once in my time with Hong Kong Salvage were we permitted to work in Chinese waters, and that was during a typhoon, when frankly the Chinese tugs didn't want to go out because it was rough and nasty, and there was a ship on fire in Chinese waters, and Marine Department were able to phone the Safety Administration in Guangzhou and got permission for us to sail straight across through Chinese waters to deal with that fire and tow the ship back. And that was before their handover. So there is that level of communication, and where safety of life is involved, I guess there's a lot of cooperation. But commercially, it hasn't affected us because we still can't work in China, or the Philippines, or Taiwan, or anywhere else. They're all closed shops. Of course, they can all work in Hong Kong, which always seemed a little bit unfair. But no, very few changes since the handover.
Any other questions? I'd like to know what you said to the Queen.
Sorry?
I'd like to know your conversation with the Queen.
Oh, no, you really wouldn't. She is convinced now that I am depriving a village somewhere of its idiot. Twice she said to me, she obviously recognised that I was one of her loyal subjects, and she wondered where I was from. So twice she said to me, "Where are you from?" And twice I said, "I'm from Swire in Hong Kong." And it was about 3 months after she left that I realised what she'd really been asking me. And I felt such a fool. But no, she's obviously done this so many times. She was marvellous, and we had, I haven't used the slide of it here, but we had the oldest building in Tuvalu. It was the first missionaries' house. It was the house they built for the first, it was just 4 walls and a roof. And the thing about Amatuka, where we were, our island, it had lots of phosphate deposits, so there was lots of vegetation. And it was where all the local witch doctors went to collect their plants for their potions. So ordinary people who were afraid of the witch doctors wouldn't go to Amatuku. So when the first Christian missionary arrived and said, "I've come to convert you to Christianity," they said, "Okay, you can go and live on that island over there." And they built him a house on Amatuku, and he sat there for 6 months, and nobody turned up to be converted. In the end, he complained, and they let him move to the main island, to the capital. But we had this, and we only used it for the duty officer. We always had one member of staff at night sleeping on campus because we had 40 boys there. We needed somebody just to keep an eye on them. And all we had in that building was a bed, a single bed. But we had a plaque, a brass plaque on the outside that told the history of the building. And I'd done my inspection just before the Queen arrived, and I closed the door because she wasn't going to go inside and see this grotty duty officer's bed. She was just supposed to read the brass plaque, which had been polished in her honour. While I was away meeting the Queen, some idiot opened the door and left it open. So when we arrived, I'm about to point out the brass plaque and I invite her to read it. She walked straight through the open door into this hovel. Luckily, somebody had made the bed. But thinking quickly, I said, "Yes, Your Majesty, you're not allowed to touch the Queen," so trying to herd her out without touching her or kick her in the leg or anything, and say, "Yes, Your Majesty, this is going to be the library. My dream is to have a library, but I've only been here a few weeks. I haven't found any books yet." And the Queen said, "You should write to the Countess of Ranfurly." Well, as you do. So I filed it away, and we got through the visit. And as soon as I could, I went over to see the librarian in the National Library, a lady called Carter Lopati, who was my minister's daughter. And I said, "Carter, have you ever heard of this thing, this person, the Countess of Ranfurly?" And she laughed, and she just pulled the book off the shelf in the National Library, opened it, and inside the cover was stamped a gift from the Ranfurly Library, Kensington Palace Barracks, London. So I wrote the letter. It's the first and only time in my life I've been able to write to someone and say, look here, the Queen says. And I wrote to the Countess of Ranfurly, who's a remarkable woman. She's written a book called, well, she had written a book called To War with Whittaker. It's a brilliant book about her wartime experiences. She went off, her husband was fighting in the Middle East. She went off to be with him, despite the fact that she wasn't allowed to. And she took the chauffeur with her, hence To War with Whittaker. She's a marvellous woman. Hermione, Countess Ranfurly. But I wrote to her and said, look here, the Queen said you might give us the library. And I got a long letter back asking me all sorts of questions about the age of the students, their reading ability, all sorts of things like that. And I filled it in, thought nothing more about it. 6 months later, the trading ship arrived from Fiji. And I got a call. There are 5 tea chests here for the maritime school. So we took the boat over and picked them up. And it was 5 tea chests full of books. And I swear, if I'd had all the bookshops in the world and all the time in the world, I could not have selected a better library for a maritime school in the Pacific. It was perfect. And I wrote to the Queen, well, to her private, you don't write to the Queen, I wrote to her private secretary and said, I did what Her Majesty suggested and bullied the Countess of Ranfurly in this brilliant library. So I got a letter back saying the Queen is very pleased, and she's written to thank the Countess of Ranfurly. All that from that conversation with her that day. So really impressive. But she is, I know she's a professional, I know she does it all the time, but she actually makes you feel as though you are the centre of attention for the time that she's with you. Even when you give really stupid answers to the questions like I did.
Are there any other questions?
Thanks, Alan. Look forward to reading your book. I remember as a young lawyer in London checking some salvage statements, and the crew, the salvage team were in Malta doing their job, pulling a tanker off the beach, and they had some downtime, and they went to the local cinema and watched their favourite movie, which was Raise the Titanic, which seemed quite appropriate. But anyway, this is an old chestnut, but what's your take on the, you mentioned no cure, no pay, but the impact on the environmental, the scopic type compensation inducements there? Have they made much of a difference in your, in your experience, in terms of approach by salvors and so on?
I think perhaps they have, because salvors are more willing. The scopic is a clause which allows you to earn money for, not necessarily for saving the ship, but for preserving the environment. So if you can't save the ship, but you can stop the pollution, you can get rewarded for that. And I think that has had an impact, because an old salvage man, I once said, how do you know when it's a Lloyd's open form case? And he said to me, an LOF case is like an elephant. It's hard to describe, but you'll know one when you see one. And I think the same is true scopic in a way. We used to look at some jobs and say, oh, I'm not touching that because that thing's going to sink. And I'm left with nothing. But then Article 14 and later scopic meant that salvors are prepared to take a risk on a ship that they think might not survive, because they know if they can preserve the environment, they can at least get paid a reasonable amount of money. But the fact that LOF itself has become so little used recently, I think is the problem, because people are going for other contracts which might not be as effective, I suspect. And of course, I'm a great fan of LOF. I think it's a sensible contract. And it achieves what they wanted to achieve with it. But as I said, last year it was only used 40 times.
Are there any other questions? If not, I think we should thank Alan very much for his very interesting and lively talk, and reward him by at least looking at his book and hopefully buying a copy. And I remind you about $20 for the university library. And thank you all very, very much for coming. Does Gary want to say? No. But thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you. And thank you
Yes, thank you very much.